It is 29 seconds past 8 in the morning on the 6th of August, 1945, and a schoolgirl named Sadako Sasaki is walking to breakfast in the city of Hiroshima. She is 2 years old. She does not yet know her name will one day be known across the world. Above her, at an altitude of roughly 9,400 meters, a single American B-29 bomber called the Enola Gay has just released its cargo. For 43 seconds, nothing happens. The city goes about its business. Trams rattle along their tracks. Shopkeepers open their shutters. Then the sky turns white. What follows in that instant is almost impossible to describe, and yet thousands of people did exactly that for the rest of their lives, in testimony after testimony, so that the world would never be permitted to forget. This is not the story of a weapon. Weapons have been written about extensively elsewhere. This is the story of the people who lived beneath it, who carried its consequences in their bodies and their families for decades afterwards, and who became known by a word the Japanese language had to invent to hold them. Hibakusha, meaning explosion-affected people. Their story matters because it is one of the only places in human history where we can hear, in first-person detail, what it is actually like to survive the deployment of a nuclear weapon against a city. That testimony very nearly vanished. It survived only because ordinary people, burned and grieving, chose to speak. To understand why their voices carry the weight they do, you have to understand the world that produced August 1945. By the summer of that year, the Second World War in the Pacific had ground into a campaign of extraordinary brutality. The firebombing of Tokyo in March had already killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single night, and dozens of other Japanese cities had been reduced to ash through conventional incendiary raids. Allied planners, having invaded Okinawa at a cost of over 12,000 American and well over 100,000 Japanese and Okinawan lives, projected that an invasion of the Japanese home islands could produce casualties numbering in the hundreds of thousands on both sides, possibly more. Japan's leadership remained divided, and to Allied intelligence showed no clear sign of imminent surrender. It was into this calculus, one weighing catastrophic loss against catastrophic loss, that the decision to use atomic weapons was made. Whether that calculus was sound remains one of the most argued questions in modern history, and reasonable, serious people still disagree about it today. What is not in dispute is what happened to the people on the ground, and it is their account, largely absent from the strategic debate, that this film is concerned with. Hiroshima was a city of some 350,000 people that morning, a regional military and industrial hub that had been left curiously untouched by the bombing campaigns ravaging the rest of Japan, precisely so its destruction could later be measured. Within a kilometer of the hypocenter, the point on the ground directly beneath the detonation, temperatures reached an estimated 3,000 to 4,000 degrees Celsius. Hot enough to fuse roof tiles and vaporize human beings so completely that only their shadows remained, burned into stone steps and walls. Tens of thousands died in the first moments. Tens of thousands more did not die immediately, and it is their experience agonizing, disorientating, and largely unrecorded by official history at the time that presented an entirely different kind of problem, not a military one, but a human one. Nobody was prepared to solve. The people who eventually gave the Hibakusha a voice were not generals or scientists. They were doctors like Michihiko Hachiya, whose diary of the weeks following the bombing became one of the first detailed medical accounts of radiation sickness ever written. They were survivors themselves, like Setsuko Thurlow, who was 13 years old and trapped beneath a collapsed building 1.8 kilometers from the hypocenter in Hiroshima, and who spent the following 70 years testifying before the United Nations and international audiences about what she witnessed. And they were writers and photographers, often working with almost no institutional support, who cataloged burns, radiation sickness, and the strange invisible illness that seemed to strike healthy-looking people down weeks or months later. That illness What we now understand as acute radiation syndrome baffled doctors at the time. Patients who had walked away from the blast with only minor visible injuries began, days later, to lose their hair, bleed from their gums, and develop a fever that would not break. Nobody in Hiroshima's medical establishment had ever treated anything like it, because nothing like it had ever happened to a civilian population before. Roughly 90% of the city's doctors were themselves killed or injured in the bombing, and most hospitals were destroyed or crippled. Care, in the truest sense, was improvised by exhausted, wounded people, treating other exhausted, wounded people with whatever bandages, oil, and salt water they could find. If you're finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and it costs nothing. 3 days later, on the 9th of August, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, a city of roughly 240,000, killing an estimated 40,000 people immediately and tens of thousands more in the following months. Among the Nagasaki Hibakusha was Sumiteru Taniguchi, 16 years old, delivering mail by bicycle when the blast threw him to the ground and burned the entire skin from his back. He would spend 21 months lying face down in hospital, unable to move, and would go on to become one of the most prominent anti-nuclear campaigners of the 20th century, showing photographs of his ruined back to audiences around the world for the rest of his life. Sadako Sasaki, the toddler from the opening, developed leukemia a decade later at age 11, and according to a story that has since become legend in Japan, began folding paper cranes in hospital in the hope of reaching 1,000 and having her wish for health granted. She died in October 1955. Her classmates later raised funds for a statue in Hiroshima's Peace Park, and to this day, children from across Japan and the world send folded paper cranes there by the million. What made the Hibakusha's testimony so difficult to give was not only trauma, though the trauma was immense. It was stigma. Survivors, particularly women, frequently found themselves shunned in marriage negotiations over fears, entirely unfounded but widespread, that radiation exposure was contagious or hereditary in some monstrous way. Many Hibakusha concealed their status for decades, moving to other cities, changing how they spoke about their past, terrified that disclosure would cost them a marriage, a job, or their children's futures. It is worth pausing on this because it means that for years, many of the people best placed to tell the world what a nuclear weapon does to a human body chose silence instead, out of fear of their own neighbors. Compare this with the way other 20th century catastrophes entered public memory. The bombing campaigns over British cities during the Blitz produced immediate, widely publicized testimony, memorialized in newsreels within days. American accounts of Pearl Harbor were recorded and broadcast almost instantly. The Hibakusha, by contrast, testified into a near vacuum for years. Occupation authorities in Japan restricted press coverage of the bombing's effects until 1949, and it was really not until the publication of John Hersey's account of 6 survivors in 1946, and later the founding of organizations by Hibakusha themselves in the 1950s, that a coherent first-person historical record began to take shape at all. Where German and Japanese wartime testimony from other atrocities was gathered rapidly by occupying powers and post-war tribunals, the Hibakusha had to organize their own testimony on their own initiative, often decades after the fact, competing against official silence rather than benefiting from official documentation. The long-term impact of that testimony is difficult to overstate, even if its material effect on policy is genuinely uncertain and still debated by historians. The Radiation Effects Research Foundation, a joint Japanese-American body, has tracked roughly 120,000 survivors and their children since the 1950s, producing the single largest body of data the world has on long-term human radiation exposure, data that has shaped radiation safety standards worldwide. Survivor testimony fed directly into the international anti-nuclear movement. C. Tsuko Thurlow shared the stage when the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017. Whether Hibakusha testimony has meaningfully restrained nuclear weapons use or proliferation is not something historians can prove with certainty, since deterrence and diplomacy involve countless other factors. but there is little dispute that it fundamentally shaped how the world understands, discusses, and morally reckons with nuclear weapons. Today, the average Hibakusha is over 85 years old, and their numbers are dwindling fast. Japan's government recorded fewer than 100,000 officially registered survivors by 2024, down from over 370,000 at the program's peak. Cities have organized urgent projects to train younger volunteers, often grandchildren of survivors, as memory keepers, people who memorize and retell a specific survivor's testimony word for word once the original witness can no longer speak. The Hiroshima Peace Memorial Museum and the Nagasaki Atomic Bomb Museum preserve both the physical remnants, scorched lunchboxes, melted rosaries, a stopped pocket watch frozen at 8:15, and the recorded voices themselves, thousands of hours of them gathered before it was too late. Return for a moment to that schoolgirl walking towards breakfast on an ordinary Monday morning. She did not choose to become a symbol. Neither did Sumiteru Taniguchi, lying face down for nearly 2 years, nor Setsuko Thurlow, trapped in the rubble at 13, nor Michihiko Hachiya, treating the dying with almost nothing to treat them with. None of them asked for what happened to them. What they did choose, in the decades that followed again and again, at enormous personal costs, was to speak, to describe the indescribable, patiently, precisely, to strangers, to parliaments, to school children, to cameras, so that the rest of us would not have to learn what they knew the hard way. That is the true legacy of the Hibakusha. Not a weapon, not a strategy, a testimony given by ordinary people who survived the extraordinary and who understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what was at stake in making sure it was never forgotten. The bomb lasted a fraction of a second, and their witness has lasted 80 years and counting.